Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. My name is Miksovsky. I'm on the Microsoft Windows design team, and today I'm going to talk about new user interface possibilities in Longhorn. As we plan out the next version of Windows, we're intent on identifying and anticipating new directions and ideas in user interface design that will be significant in the era of Longhorn applications. And today, I'd like to talk about some of those ideas. This is all being done under a framework for user experience that we call Arrow. Arrow is the name for the user experience in Longhorn. And I'm going to talk about a number of ideas today. Not everything we're doing in Arrow, but just some of the new things that you can incorporate into your applications. And as I do it, I'm going to talk about some of the ideas, the thinking behind them, some of the guidelines. But more importantly, what I want to convince you is that for every idea we come up with, every direction in user interface design that we identify, we build support directly into the platform that makes it easy for you to advance your application in those directions. So for every idea that we want to have a framework class, a tool, a template, a style sheet, something that takes that idea, gives form to that idea, that makes it easy for you to incorporate that idea into your application's user interface so that you can better satisfy your customers. Today I'm going to be focusing on the Avalon side of the presentation framework. Arrow spans the whole of the WinFX platform, including WinFS, our people and groups work, Indigo, but primarily today I'm going to focus on Avalon and some namespaces inside of system.windows, including system.windows.desktop and navigation. And let's start with navigation. A few years ago at the PDC, I gave a talk called Lessons Learned from the Web. And the idea behind that talk was that when the web came out, it kind of took the client world by storm, that there were very different ways that a user interface could be developed, an entire area that had been overlooked by client developers. And there were some techniques that could be lifted out of the web context and incorporated into client application design to produce better user experiences. Chief among those ideas is the notion of navigation, that you can take a frame with pages in it where a user browses between those pages using hyperlinks and tools like back or favorites, and that this can be just as effective, if not more effective, in a client application as on a website. And in particular, what I'll talk about today is how that might be useful for browsing through interrelated information and guiding the user through tasks. Why do we think that navigation is interesting? Well, there's a number of reasons. Among other things, it lets you focus the user's attention on a set of tools and information that you think the user may find useful at this point in time. They can always go back to what they saw before. They can move on, but for now, this is what they're looking at. When we think about designing user interfaces, it's not just enough to look at what the user has on the screen, but also to think about the experience that they have as they interact with the interface. So even more than the way that the web works, what's interesting is the experience that it produces in the user's mind. If you watch people use a really well-designed website, there's a fantastic flow to the whole experience where the user is moving between pages, between information, between tasks, almost effortlessly. Everything's sort of working in lockstep. And they're not only getting their job done, they're doing it with a sense of ease. And that's something that we think is vital to bring to client applications as well. We don't think that this can be done in a one-size-fits-all kind of way. We can't give guidelines that say everyone should have a back button in their application. Instead, as we chart out our user experience for Longhorn, we're trying to identify a set of application archetypes, common applications that represent a broad set of applications, and try and develop guidelines for each class so that when you're developing, say, a document editor or a database or a utility program, you can draw upon the specific guidelines as they pertain to your class of application. And we can think about navigation in each of these application classes in a different way, with perhaps the exception of MechWarrior or Halo. So we'll start by talking about how you might use navigation as the top-level organizing principle behind your application, the top-level window. There's two main application base classes in Avalon. There's application, which was described in the previous talk that Chris Anderson gave. And this is useful for a traditional application. There will be many of these applications in Windows Longhorn. We don't think that a traditional window with a traditional window title bar is going to go away. But we think that in addition to that, we can offer a new application-based class called navigation, in which navigation has been fundamentally worked into the fabric of the app. So the navigation application class includes a number of services for navigation beyond what's offered in the base application class. And when you're deciding which one to use, you have to look at your application situation. If you're designing an application where the user is going to multitask between a variety of activities all at once, and they're going to need a large set of tools to bring to bear on their current context, then the traditional application and the traditional, for example, SDI windowing model may be what you're looking for. If you're designing, on the other hand, an application that has a large volume of information or has a certain quality to it in which the user proceeds through activities in a fairly predictable fashion, where they go from one step to another and they're finished with the first before moving on to the second, navigation may be appropriate, and the navigation application base class may be appropriate for you. Now, the notion of navigation in a navigation application is important enough that we've actually taken the controls for navigation and put those into the window itself. So we actually have not one, but two different kinds of windows you can start from if you're building a navigation application. And it's really a simple matter to choose between those, and you can change your decision later. Chris showed in the previous talk adding the host and browser property to an application to change from one form to the other. We'll start with that. The Windows Explorer today is a tool that's used to browse websites, and it browses the file system. In Longhorn, it also browses apps. We expect to see many, many more apps running inside of Explorer, and we've made that easy by incorporating that ability into the navigation application class. The application runs inside of the real Explorer frame, and the purpose in doing so is that you're allowing the user to move freely into and out of your application, just like they would a website. Now, this means that they can get into your application very quickly. Maybe they can even will allow them to bookmark a page inside of your application, so they can come in very easily, and they can leave very easily. They can pick another favorite, or they can type in the address bar and then leave your application. And your application's pages will remain inside the navigation journal, so the user can always go back to where they were inside your app. There's a set of standard navigation controls at the top of the browser, at the top of Explorer. These include a back and a forward button. It's worth noting that because we think that there will be many navigation applications on the screen, and there's a lot of controls that go along with navigation, like favorites and the address bar, we've done a lot of work to try and smooth out the design for this so that the user interface controls for navigation fade into the background and are not in the user space when they're not busy navigating. So, for example, we've taken the step of hiding the forward button when it's not available, rather than simply disabling it. Similarly, the address bar does not look interactive until you mouse over it, at which point the controls become 3D. You can click on them. You can also click there and type. This incurs a small cost up front. It may take a user a little while to realize that they can click on one of these buttons, but we think in the long term the user's better off for that, because as they have a number of windows up on the screen, they don't end up with 10 different copies of the forward button or the address bar staring them in the face. There's another window that you can use. Explorer is just one. You can start by using what we call navigation window. Navigation window is a class that you'd use if you want to have complete control over the navigation experience. If you run through Visual Studio in the build that you've all received, in the goods, there's a template for creating a navigation application, and it will create a window by default like this called navigation window. I'll show a little bit of that template later. You can stick with the standard controls here. They're a slightly smaller set because the user here is operating inside of your app as a self-contained world of pages. The idea is that You've defined boundaries around your app. That boundary is this window. And inside of that, the user can move around, but it's generally not intended for the user to browse freely around to the rest of the world. How do you decide which window to use? Well, as I said, Explorer is good for letting the user get into and out of your app. That might be appropriate if you're building an application that the user might pick up for a few minutes and then put away, or use on a very infrequent basis or a transient basis. Navigation window might be more useful in contexts where the user is in your application for a long stretch of time. For example, if they perform something in your app as part of their regular job function and they're sitting there doing something all day. Navigation features can also be useful in traditional applications. The Explorer window and navigation window are great if your entire application is about navigation, but even if you're developing, say, a document editor, it might be interesting to put navigation into a pop-up window, such as a wizard, or to embed a navigable frame in a pane at the side of the window, and this is made very easy through dock panels in Avalon. You can also say that even if your top-level navigation, or even if your top-level window is not a navigation window, you might want to make one of the child windows navigable. So a good example of this might be the object browser in Visual Studio, which uses hyperlinks and a back button to let you explore the .NET namespace. Let's think about what we've already covered and apply it to a scenario. Let's imagine that there's a company that sells building materials. They have an orders database. That's a line of business product that they use to keep track of their sales orders. And this product is used day in and day out by sales reps taking orders over the phone. We'll use this as our scenario for navigation and some other features that I'll talk about later. Now, the people who work in this application have decided that navigation might be interesting here because they've noticed that the reps at this particular company generally deal with one order at a time. So they've decided to explore navigation as a way of as a windowing model in this product. Because the product is used heavily by the sales reps, they're in it for a long stretch of time, they've decided to build their product using navigation window rather than hosting in browser. There's two main pages that I'll show. There's a list of orders. This is a fairly canonical example. You have your list of sales orders. When you select one, you want to be able to look at a screen that shows you details for that particular order. So let's go through and see how that would work. I hope you're not going to sleep. Let's see. So I've used the template in Visual Studio to create a navigation application, and it automatically created for me several items, including something called My App. This is the application object itself, and as you see, it's marked as a navigation application. It has code behind it, myapp.xaml.cs. The main application object, as you've already learned, is a useful place to define resources that will be available throughout your application. So we can use this as a place, among other things, to maintain a connection to our order database. So the first thing we'll do is add a connection to our order database and expose that as a member on the application object. The second thing we want to do is take advantage of a window that was created for us by the template, a navigation window, and open that when the application runs. Now, currently in Visual Studio, you'll see a lot of the nuts and bolts of a navigation window, all the controls and their behavior exposed here in this lovely markup. But we'll be cleaning that up as we go forward. So what we want to do when the user runs the application is instantiate a new instance of that window. We're going to instantiate a new instance of our list page, our list of orders, and I'll show that in a second. And then we want to show the window. In the interest of time, I've already gone ahead and created the markup for this page that lists the set of orders. And although this talk isn't about data binding, it's worth mentioning a little bit about how this works. In the loaded event for this page, I'm going to go ahead and set the data context for this page to the list of orders. And what this does is say that this page is associated with that list, and then in the markup for that page, I can do things like create a list box here that binds to the list of orders using this syntax. I can set through data binding and a facility called data styling, I can set a style on each item in the list. This will be applied to each of the orders, and that's defined here in the resources for this page. So here's the order style, and this order style includes a number of the columns of our list, and here we see that we can bind to the properties of the orders that we care about, such as their order number and customer name. So now we've got just enough done to have our application stand up for the first time and bind to our database. Here I'm using a local store that's been wrapped in an array list data collection so that it's exposed to the data binding system. So here's our list of orders. It's been populated automatically from the records that are already in the store. What we want to do now is add some navigation. So I've got some buttons down here, new and edit, that I'd like to wire up so that when the user selects an item, they can click edit to navigate to its details, or click new to see the details for a new order. So in the code behind our list page, for our edit button, we're going to grab the selected order off of the list box. Because we're using data styling, the selected item in this list box is the real order, not some strings or a representation of it. It's the actual order object. So I can take that business object and then instantiate an instance of our details page, set the data context on that page to be the order that we care about, and then navigate to it. To create a new record and navigate to that, it looks very similar, except first we create a new order, add it to our database, and then we again instantiate a new details page, set its data context, and navigate to it. This details page again is built in markup. Here I'm using doc panels as the organizing principle behind the page. And this also uses data binding. So for example, here we have a text element that's going to bind to our order number. In our details page, the one thing that we want to do here to complete our navigation story is to wire up a button on that page called done so that it navigates back to our list page. So we'll commit the changes to our database when the user clicks done and navigate to the list page again. Here I'm using a local store. Through data binding, I'd be able to bind to any store. It could be on SQL. It could use the new object spaces system in WIDBE. Or I could use an in-memory collection of objects that support iCollection change and iProperty change. So now we've got our set of orders. When we select one and click edit, we'll navigate to that details page, and the details page will be automatically populated with all the fields from that record. The list page, as we'd expect, is still in the navigation journal. We can navigate forward. We can say done. We're back at our list page. So this is basic navigation in an application that's using data binding. It's using layout. It's using navigation to create a fairly interesting, if straightforward, database client. Let's talk for a little bit about this particular screen, this order detail screen. There's zillions of these in the world, these data entry forms. And for the people who use these applications every day, they become experts at these forms. They know exactly how many times they need to hit the tab key to move to the next field they care about. And they know exactly what specific information might need to be entered into the product code field, say. It's not always the case that people are expert in all the cases that they might come across. 95% of the orders that a sales rep takes might be very straightforward and involve filling out this form in a very routine way. But one of the things we've discovered when we talk to people like IT professionals or VARs who develop this sort of software is an interesting thing. which is that even someone who uses a product like this as part of their job, day in and day out, that person may occasionally come across situations that are just so infrequent that they're not sure how they should fill out this form. And so the thing that they might do is they might put a range of Post-it notes around their monitor that document all the weird cases that they occasionally come across, like a product return or a drop shipment or something else that's unusual. Let's imagine that in this particular case, we've got our sales order system at this company is used. Here they're selling they're selling building materials, and occasionally they come across custom orders. They sell a variety of windows in standard sizes, but occasionally they come across windows in custom sizes. And maybe this only makes up a small percentage, a few percent of their business. So the people who enter these orders just aren't familiar enough with how they should actually fill out this form to handle a custom order. And the result is some lost, it could be something simple like just some lost time while they figure out what to do, or perhaps it could result in direct costs as someone on the factory floor or the shop floor who's building a product to the specifications that are documented in the order, they discover that they don't actually have the information they need to build the order out. And to the people who manage IT at this company, they care a great deal about this. And so they'd like to make sure that even when someone comes across a task that's infrequent, like a custom order in this case, that they have a way of doing that. So let's talk a little bit about that in more detail. You can think about all the tasks that a user might have to do on a range from infrequent to very, very frequent. There are the things you do day in and day out. You're in Outlook all the time. You're in Visual Studio all the time. And then there's the things that you don't do very often. Maybe partition a hard drive or add a new user to your computer. And for each activity, you can think about the degree of control that the application gives you in that task. What do we mean by this? One way of looking at it is who's in the driver's seat. Is it the application that's taking the lead and you're sort of giving it a little bit of direction, but mostly it's the one who's driving? Or has the application put you in the driver's seat? In a case of our typical sales order, someone's in this product so much, therefore it's a regular activity, and they want to be in control of it because they know what they're doing. And this is exactly the right thing to do for something that someone does day in and day out. The app's job here is to offer the user features and say, user, you know what you're doing, so I'm just going to give you a bunch of tools, and you put them together in the right way to accomplish the result that you care about. And for this to work, the user has to invest some of their time and energy up front in learning how to use the system, and perhaps on an ongoing basis, picking up the tricks in this application so that they can master it. They're willing to do this because they get productivity gains from doing so. But if we consider the case of our custom order or any infrequent task, it's simply not the case that someone's willing to invest in mastering a task that they're only going to do once every few months, once a year, or maybe just once ever. So for there, we want to take something that just gives the user very minimal assistance and simply presents them with a set of fields to fill out, to something that's much more structured. In the context of this talk, I can only look at a simple example. So we'll just imagine that we're going to create a page here that collects from the sales representative the information that must be captured to do a custom sales order and make sure that they get the right information from the customer. Some people might look down on trying to put this sort of assistance directly into the user interface. It's important to keep in mind that this isn't something the user is going to see every day. This is something the user is going to do infrequently, and therefore they may not only tolerate this form of assistance, but come to demand it. This is exactly what happens on the web. The websites very well-designed websites do an extremely good job at taking a user through a task that they may only do once and making sure that they get to the end and get to that button that says submit order, because that's the way they're going to make their money. So what we want to do is move out of that upper left quadrant and move down in this area where the software is going to lead the user through the task. It's going to provide a little more guidance, The software knows more about what's going on, perhaps, than the user, so it's having a little dialogue for the user. It's acting as, say, a consultant with the user to get them through this task. We don't think that everyone should be in one quadrant or the other. Both are appropriate based on the situation. Sometimes you want to be in the car and you want to be sitting at the wheel. And sometimes, if you're at an unfamiliar city and you're at a conference, you'd prefer to let the bus driver drive because you don't know where you're going. So we think both of these models can work. What about the other two? We've got two more quadrants here. In general, they're bad news. If you think about all the applications you use and the ones that really tick you off, a lot of times they're working in one of these other two quadrants. They're either putting you in the driver's seat in some situation that you don't understand at all. So you're in an unfamiliar place and they say, well, why don't you drive? Or you're doing something that you know very well how to do, and they insist on taking the wheel. The application insists on doing things, and it insists on helping you, whether you want it or not. And this is a little bit, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of having someone taking a taxi cab to a place like your office or your home that you go very much, and being frustrated with the route that the driver's taking. This is something that comes up in applications all the time when they give you a wizard to do something that you do every day. We want to provide some guidance for how to guide users through tasks. In our Aero user experience guidelines, we include a model and a process for designing navigation-based tasks that we call inductive user interface design. There's been some very preliminary material on this subject posted on MSDN for a while, and that eventually will be folded into our Aero guidelines. It includes things like text guidelines, layout guidelines, and some general topologies for pages, navigating through pages that seem to work well. At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that for everything that we want to recommend to you in guidelines, we want to provide a component of our platform that directly helps you do that. So as an example of that, let's consider how you might guide the user through this task using navigation by performing a task in frame. So we have a details page, and we have our custom order page, and we want to let the user navigate from one to the other inside the same frame. Standard way to do this is with hyperlinks. So you navigate from the order page to the details to the custom task page, and then use a hyperlink to go back. This can work. It does have some issues. It creates a tight coupling of these two pages. They both know about each other. They both depend on each other in a very tight way. This might not be bad in this particular example, but if we were hypothetically to scale it up, perhaps that we have this custom order task and we want to launch it from more than one place, say our list and our details page. So there's hyperlinks to the custom order task from both places. What does that order task do? The user clicks some button in there, next or done or something, to finish that task. Where does that hyperlink go? It doesn't have any easy way of knowing where to take the user, because really the right place to take the user back to depends on where they came from. We've seen this in usability tests over and over again, that if you take them to someplace other than where they started the task, when they're done with the task, if you take them someplace else, they'll be confused. You really want to make sure you take them to where they started the task. And the problem here is that the hyperlink is fundamentally a one-way trip. It's a unidirectional construct. There's another construction in programming that works very similar to this. That's so reviled that its name sometimes strikes fear into people. It's the go-to statement. And hyperlinks can behave like this. They have a lot of the same problems as go-to statements in letting you maintain your code. So for example, if you design a page that navigates between a bunch of other pages, and then you want to move that page somewhere else in your product, you may break all kinds of links, just like you might break a bunch of things if you moved a procedure around in code. And for a lot of the same reasons that people struggle with hyperlinks, they end up having to come up with a variety of hacks to work around its problems. So you've probably seen many websites that use URLs like the one you see here, where one site calls another and then says, oh, by the way, here's this page. Please, if you wouldn't mind, return the user to me when you're done. And this can work. The hack can, it's used effectively in many cases. One of its shortcomings is that it's inherently a proprietary mechanism. So you've got two people who are more or less agreeing, yeah, I guess we'll interact in this way, these two pages interacting in this way. But it depends on their cooperation, and it's unique that this parameter here might only work for that case of this particular site calling this other particular site. What we'd rather have is a way of, in order to support our guidelines for getting users through tasks and bringing them to where they started, we'd rather have something that replaced this go-to statement. And what we'd rather have is some way of invoking a page or a set of pages as a function. And for that reason, we've created a new programming construct and built that into the platform that we call a page function. You can think of a page function as a page that's called like a function. This page is defined in markup or code like any other page. And like a function, it can return a result to its caller. It can accept parameters. And by default, it will return the user to where they started, although that can be overridden. And this allows you to define pieces of navigable UI that can be reused in a very clean way. So when we navigate from our orders page, our details page, to our custom order task, we're going to do that with a page function invocation. And then when the user's finished entering a custom order, we're going to navigate back to this details page by returning, just like you would return a result in a function. Although I'm not going to show the next part, it would easily scale up so that you could navigate to this task from multiple places, and the page function would automatically return to the user to wherever they started from. Let's see how that works. So the first thing we're going to do is go into the markup for our details page. And we're going to add a link to it. This is a hyperlink, although we're not going to supply a URI. Instead, we're just going to use this as a control on the screen and then write a click handler for it. Now let's take a look at this handler. We're going to instantiate a page function that I'll show you in a second. Let's show it now. Let's look at it now. We'll add that to our project. As I said, a page function is something that can be defined in markup and code like any other page. Here I'm using as the top-level tag, object page function. This is our way right now of indicating that this is a page function that returns an object as its result. And then we use XAML here to define the layout for this page. At the bottom of the page, we have a button that says done, and this will indicate that the page function is finished. So in our click handler on the order page, we're going to instantiate that custom order task. We're going to indicate that we want to be advised when that returns. A page function is actually an asynchronous function, so there's two components. There's the call itself, and you supply a call back that will be invoked when the page function returns. And so here that's done by setting something called not currently by calling non-generic return. And we define a particular event handler that will be invoked when the page function returns. And then we navigate to this page function like any other page. In the code for the page function itself, I mentioned that there's a done button. When the user clicks that, we want to return to where they came. We want to indicate that the page function is done. So what we'll do is package up the information about this custom sales order into an object here called custom product. We'll indicate that that's, on an args object, we'll indicate that that's the result of this page function. And then we'll call something called onFinish, which signals to the frame that this page function is complete. The page function will then, the frame will then take care of invoking the event handler here called create custom order finish on the caller. So we'll go and write a handler for that. Here's create custom order finished. This extracts the custom product information out of the arguments to this delegate. And then we'll use that information, that custom product information, to populate a new line item in our sales order. Right now, there's some, I mentioned that we have something, there's something here called non-generic result. Page functions at the moment are best used with a small set of standard classes like strings, ints, and objects. We're going to be taking advantage of the generics in WIDBE so that you can define a page function of type T, where T is the result type that you'd like to return to your caller. So you can define a page function that returns an object of any type and do that in a strongly typed way. So we'll go and create, now we've got our order details page and we have a new link. Let's fill out some information for our customer. Then click this link. We navigate in frame to our page function. So here, the sales representative who might be doing a task they don't do very often has all the assistance they might need, all the instructions they need, and tools that they might need to get information, the right information from their customer and make sure they've filled out things correctly. So depending on what kind of order they're completing, they may have different fields to fill out. And as they do that, they can see here an estimate of the cost of that, so they can give that as a quote to the customer. And when they say done, this will invoke that handler we spoke of. It'll invoke that callback and let the details page know that the page function is done. The details page then updates itself by adding a new line item here, so we can see the information we've entered, everything that the factory floor will need to be able to manufacture this custom order is captured and the cost is correctly calculated. We can then add that to our database and that'll be committed as a change in our database. So that's basically how page functions work. Interestingly, a page function, I said it's an asynchronous function, so it gets called and then it invokes a callback when it's finished. That page function, the page for it, is still sitting here in our navigation stack. So we can actually invoke the return handler. We can have the page function is essentially a function that might get called once but return many times if the user backs up to this page and completes it again. So we come in here and type in something else. We'll come back here and they can complete that page again. Now it'll depend on the context whether this is appropriate to happen or not. So you'll need to look at your own situation to decide, is it necessary for the pages that the user goes through for this task to remain in the navigation journal? That's what happens by default. Or should those pages be removed from the journal so the user can't accidentally back up into them and mess things up? I don't know how many times you've seen in the web a page that says something like, warning, this page is expired, because you backed up into something like a purchase on an e-commerce site. So in Avalon, and using our navigation framework, you can remove the pages from the journal cleanly at the time the page function completes. So this sort of user interface for guiding a user through a task is very easy to put together, and it's very appropriate for those situations that I described where something's infrequent and the user doesn't want to have to invest their own time and energy in mastering a piece of UI. They really just care about the end result, not the means. What about assistance in a screen that the user does use all the time? So if the user's here in this order details page, or maybe they're all the way back in our list of orders. Let's see. Yeah. So here in our list of orders, what about a screen like this? Even if the user uses this feature, this particular screen, day in and day out, they may know most of what the screen can do for them, but there may be some things that occasionally they want to refer, they may need help with. Or when they're editing information here, they'd like to have some assistance. They don't want this assistance there all the time. They want it there on demand because in general they know what they're doing. They need it some of the time. The standard way to handle this is with help. Help today has a number of shortcomings, one of which is there's a window management problem. So that typically if there's a help button on a page like this, you click it, you get a help window up on top of your application, and then you have to manage, position the help window and the application window so that you can follow along in the instructions as you go through the task in the application itself. You've seen in a lot of applications, for example, Microsoft Office, a help pane that positions itself next to the application so the user can follow along as they perform the instructions that are described for them. But rather than just recommending, hey, this might be a good idea, we've gone ahead and built something into the platform that we call the help pane. And let's go and add a help pane to our product. Help content is authored in Longhorn using a specific markup schema for assistance that captures a lot of the semantics that go with creating help topics. I don't have time to go through the whole process here, but I've gone ahead and created some help content that we'll now add to our application. So we go to the markup for our list page. We can add a button, a help button. It has a click handler, help button click. And we'll add that click handler. That simply instantiates something called system.help.pane. That's going to be our help pane object. And then we indicate the URI that we want to navigate to. That's the resources that I described here, like this. So let's go run that. There was a talk on day one of the conference that spoke in more detail about the help pane and how you author content for it in the build that you've got. There's also an article on the Longhorn Developer Center if you're interested in how to build help content for Longhorn. The build process for help takes all the different markup files for your different help topics and compiles them into a single package where that package can then get submitted to the system. The help content in it will get promoted out into WinFS, where it will be visible to the WinFS engine so that we can do things like perform searches on it. So when a user searches in the general search entry point in Longhorn, they might get hits not only on all their documents or their email or websites, but also on help topics. So here we see the help content for this page, or the user might be able to navigate inside this pane itself to additional help topic. And as they do that, be able to follow along in the procedure, any procedure defined in this help pane as they work inside this application. So this is another system service that you can take advantage of. We've looked at the help pane here, and we've talked about page functions. These are ways of interacting with a user. There's sort of a spectrum of possibilities that you can use to interact with a user. When you have something, your app has something it wants to say to the user, there are a variety of ways of getting their attention and requesting or demanding a response. So let's talk just a little bit about some new ways of interacting with users in Longhorn. We can look at these just to give some organization to the variety here. We can look at them on a spectrum from sort of in your face to out of the way. I need to know, I need to have you tell me something, to not very interactive at all. In XP, we already have a fairly interesting spectrum of ways of interacting with user, from very small things like tooltips to very heavyweight things like an app modal dialog. The help pane or a task pane is one new way that you can interact with a user. There are some others. In the talk preceding this one, we looked at embedded dialogues. These are dialogues that are modal to a single window in an application only, so that if your application happens to have 5 windows up at the moment and needs to display a dialogue, it can make, on one of those windows, it can do so without blocking interaction with the other 4. Another thing that's been covered in several other talks in the conference are notifications. Notifications are lightweight little windows that appear next to the sidebar, and these are driven by a WinFS technology we call the info agent. There's a set of rules that a user can create for when they want to see these notifications, and you can look at that in the SDK. The last new interaction technique that I want to look at today is the sidebar. So you've already seen in a number of talks this bar along the side of the screen. It's a pretty interesting thing. I've gotten lots of comments from people, or a lot of questions at Ask the Experts last night and some other sessions here about the sidebar, so I want to talk a little bit about that now. The sidebar is all about peripheral awareness of information. This isn't just another place where to stick stuff on the screen. You really need to think about what's the purpose here. We want users to be in one application but monitoring what's going on elsewhere. So this isn't, when you think about the sidebar tile, That's our name for these little modules that appear in the sidebar. Your question isn't, should I make my application a sidebar tile? Really, the question is there a meaningful companion piece to my application that's useful to a user when they're not running my application or when they're not looking at my application? What small amount of information might they want to keep track of when they're doing something else, like they're in email or they're browsing? The sidebar, as you've seen, if you've played with the builds or gone to the hands-on lab, is a very prominent piece of user interface. It consumes a substantial fraction of the screen. So we want to make sure that we get a lot out of it. And it's important that sidebar tiles be designed efficiently. I'll talk a little bit about those guidelines in a second. There's a variety of components and flavors that go into designing a tile. There's the tile itself. If the tile itself can't display everything it needs to say, it can also produce a little bit more information on demand through something we call a flyout. The flyout just gives the user a little bit more information, a few more tasks. It's not really meant to be a replacement for your application's main window. It's a way to let the user quickly do one thing before returning to what they were doing before. If the user has many tiles open, some of those tiles may be collapsed to a small state that we refer to as a sidebar icon. And there may also be tiles where the information they need to communicate is very specific and can be expressed in a very compact way. And so they may choose to take on a form that is only an icon. For example, the little blinking lights for a network status indicator just let you know that the network's live. That may be all the user needs, in which case a tile might be the way to go. Because the sidebar is so prominent, it's important to be efficient. There's a number of rules here. If you're interested, we've got a good start on a chapter in our user experience guidelines that's up on the Longhorn Developer Center that talks all about the sidebar, and I encourage you to go look at it. These are just some of the highlights. For one thing, for example, we've discovered that it's really important that sidebar tiles be designed well enough that they can express their purpose without needing a label. So funnily enough, when we look at users and watch them in usability tests, it turns out that they don't actually need the word clock written above a clock to know what it's trying to tell them. Go figure. It also is important to put this information in context. So while it's useful for me to know that my PDC presentation starts at 5 p.m., it's really useful for me to know that my PDC presentation starts in 5 minutes. So putting that information into context often lets you be more compact, more concise, and more meaningful to the user. Let's think about what a sidebar tile, what meaningful sidebar tile we could create following these guidelines for our little canonical sales order system here. The sales representatives who use this system do not need this tile. They're in this product all day. So they don't need another way of finding out this information. But perhaps the managers in this company aren't in the application all day and would like to keep track of how things are going. So we're going to build a tile for them. And because that's so simple, we'll do that from scratch using a template in Visual Studio. It's the tile template. For a manager, we could show them something like the sum, the dollar figure sum of the active orders in the system or a count of the orders in the system. But perhaps we can make that more contextual. So for this example, let's imagine that we want to take the orders that are in the system and express them in the context of a sales goal for the current time period. When you use the Visual Studio template to create a tile, it'll create a number of components for you. The basic object that you start with is called base tile. This is analogous to the application class for a tile. So here what we're going to do, since we're doing this from scratch, we're going to go ahead and add a reference to our order database. And then in the initialize call that's made on this tile, we're going to do something that's fairly common in a tile. when your tile's initialized, in addition to displaying some markup, it's fairly common to want to spin up some thread that does something. Maybe it's communicating using Indigo with a web service, or here I've got a simple little object that watches for changes in the order database, and that will trigger an event handler when an order changes. In our project, there's also two pieces of XAML that are created, tile foreground and tile background. In the guidelines chapter I referred to, it describes in more detail how these two work together. But in general, the foreground is the best place to put controls, and the background is for any sort of image or anything that's going on in the background. There's a variety of reasons for this, and it's another example of where, if you look at our guidelines, we try and describe how to break apart your sidebar UI into these two pieces. So we figured that it's important to carry that forward into our tools so that the tools make it easy to follow the guidelines. The tile itself can be defined in markup like anything else in Avalon. So we'll go ahead and add a simple text element and give it an ID that we can keep track of. And then in the code behind this tile, we're going to write a little procedure that will accept some status information about progress towards sales goal, and then push that information into our piece of markup, our text element. The reason for doing this is sort of a roundabout way of doing it. The reason for that is that we want to have our event handler here back in our tile object. Whenever this order database changes, we'd like to update the tile with our new information. But because the tile and our little order watcher are running in separate threads, when an order is changed, the thread that's keeping track of that information, that's monitoring the database for changes, needs to let the thread that owns the user interface, the tile itself, take care of updating the UI. In Avalon, there's a concept called a UI context. And so in this event handler that's triggered whenever an order in the database changes, we get a reference to the tile, the foreground of the tile, obtain its context, and then call begin invoke on this. We'll pass it a delegate to invoke, and that'll be this display progress call. So at the moment, the way that you construct tiles is put together with some string and duct tape. Eventually, it'll be handled through our application manifests. At the moment, what happens is that when you build a tile, it will get a variety of registry keys will be set up to point to your tile. So for the moment, we're going to ignore the man behind the command prompt while we register an assembly that the tile needs, and we'll load up our tile. That was pretty easy. And then we'll go ahead just to prove that everything works. We'll run our application again. Let's create a new order. And let's use our task again to enter a new order. Let's create and in the upper right-hand corner, you see the status of that order change. So this is an example of how easy it is to create a tile that's monitoring something for information and then letting the user know about that in a peripheral way while they're doing something else. I hope I've been able to show that we're thinking about a lot of new interesting ideas that we hope are interesting to you in your application's user interface. And as we create guidelines for that under the umbrella of what we call Arrow, that we're building support for those directly into our platform, the WinFX platform. Among those ideas that I've talked about today, navigation we think is great for creating applications that browse through information spaces or guide users through tasks. And we've also got some new tools for interacting with users, like the help pane and sidebar. If you're interested in this, we have more material on the Longhorn Developer Center on MSDN. There's several articles there that will be interesting. There's a white paper on this topic of user control that I spoke of. There's a whole chapter all about our guidelines. Thank you very much.